generates such massive and powerful inhibition of one's natural joie de vivre? Why are Japanese so inhibited emotionally and intellectually? Ultimately, I speculate it's due to Japan's island habitat and its history of rice growing. The idea of using rice to feed the population was imported from China and Korea more than a millennium ago, that is about 2,000 years after the Chinese were doing the same thing. Rice is a very efficient food source, that is, many calories per square meter can be grown, and so in the early years of Japanese rice cultivation, population growth was rapid. The old hunter-gatherer lifestyle could support only a small population because food capture levels were low. So once rice agriculture was introduced, more children could survive until Japan ran out of land. Experiments showed that if you put too many rats in a cage, even if there's plenty of food, etc., then their behavior will become neurotic. I believe the Japanese are fundamentally neurotic for the same reason as the rats, overcrowding. Over many centuries, the Japanese have learned that to keep the collective peace, it's paid to inhibit the personalities of its population, so that they did not express freely their feelings and opinions, because if they did, society suffered. Japan has half the population of the US crammed into a fifth of the area of California. For many centuries, the Japanese have lived with small housing, with 3 generations squashed together. To keep the peace, traditions of a public and private self have developed. If you are Japanese, you will present a stereotype masked to strangers. One presents one's true opinions, hone, to few friends, only very gradually as the level of familiarity increases. I thus believe that the major reason why Japanese have such masochistic opinions is due, indirectly, to rice. As far as I know, all Asian cultures have this face psychology, that is, the public mask for politeness reasons. But Japan has it worst, because it is an island whose political boundaries are rigid, that is, the boundaries are set geographically, not militarily. I think the above gives an idea to explain Japanese masochism. Even today, it's not difficult to see clear cases of this phenomenon. For example, it's a regular occurrence on Japanese TV to see masochistic competitions. For example, who can stay in a bath of ice water the longest, who can eat the most rice cakes, etc. These game shows are very popular and reflect a collective preoccupation of the Japanese with self-inflicted pain. To Westerners, this just seems sick. Now, what about Japanese sadism? It's well known amongst psychologists that masochism and sadism are closely linked. That is why the two tend to be mentioned in the same breath, sadomasochism, rather like electromagnetism. The Japanese have an international reputation for being one of the cruelest peoples on the planet. They are still hated by their Asian neighbours, at least by those people old enough to remember what the Japanese did to them in World War II. I have read that the Vietnamese, for example, have more or less forgiven the Americans, but have not forgiven the Japanese, who invaded the country several decades before the Americans, who were so much crueler. Where does Japanese cruelty come from? Again, I can only hypothesize. I suspect it is a consequence of their supreme insularity and frustration, which comes from those factors which make the Japanese such masochists. For example, when the Japanese were invading the Asian continent, they were temporarily freed from the social constraints they suffered daily in Japan. These constraints were severe due to the fascist nature of the government at the time. They could express those frustrations on their victims without fear of punishment. The Japanese soldiers' frustrations were severe, hence so was their cruelty. The Japanese did not respect the Geneva Convention. They treated their prisoners like animals, who then died like flies. The Japanese made themselves hated. Also, the insularity of the Japanese is so strong that it's easy for them to see their enemies as subhuman. Even today, with my best Japanese friends, with whom I have a strong genetic compatibility, they half-jokingly refer to me as Martian. I have never met a more insular-minded people than the Japanese. It's much easier to mistreat people when you do not understand them, or when they appear alien to you. For example, the Nazis and the Japs committed massive war crimes, both killing tens of millions of people, yet the American soldiers had more respect for the Germans than the Japanese, due to a greater level of familiarity. German culture is not so different from American, whereas the Japs, in the war, were often treated like insects. The Japs treated the Western prisoners of war, POWs, in the same way, but with far greater cruelty. Japan is still sadistic. Bullying is a major problem in the schools, especially at junior high school level, when the educational authorities really start turning the screws to make their students true Japanese. The conformist social pressures on the students and their very heavy workload with after-school grammar schools, jukus, and the endless pressure to learn the Chinese characters and their combinations create a hothouse of frustrations, which are often expressed in the form of bullying. This bullying regularly becomes so severe that some students suicide. One reads regular reports in the newspapers of student suicides due to bullying. To stop the bullying, one cannot just ease up on the educational pressures. One needs to remodel the whole social system in Japan, and that will not happen without a major crisis. I'm hoping that the current economic failure that Japan is now undergoing may be strong enough for the Japanese to fundamentally rethink their inferior, by Western standards, social structure. The Japanese suffer so much from their own social ignorance and insularity. There are better ways to live. Intellectually sterile. I don't admire the Japanese intellectually. In fact, I'm quite contemptuous of them in that respect. I grew up in Australia and left that country because it was not intellectual enough for me. I wanted to live in a culture which valued my values, that is, which felt passionately about ideas and debated them with relish. So why am I living in Japan if I feel the same way about the country? Well, for reasons of money, of course. If Japan can outperform America in terms of investment in blue sky scientific research and is willing to import large numbers of talented foreign researchers, then I can surround myself with these foreigners and largely ignore Japanese intellectual sterility. A researcher's first priority, of course, is to be employed in one's chosen field. I admire Japan's ability to make money, its high savings rate, and its willingness to invest in high tech. But as intellectuals, the Japanese are pygmies in my view. They are far too inhibited to be good intellectuals. Some cultures are better than others in fostering intellectualism. In Japan, the emphasis is on being considerate to others, not challenging them intellectually or making them lose an argument, and hence lose face in the Asian sense. Japanese people have the reputation of quitting an argument as soon as it gets interesting, as seen by Americans. Meaning that as soon as a potential disagreement pops up, the Japanese will bow out. I've seen a few free-for-all discussions on Japanese TV amongst Japanese journalists and invited experts, so it is possible, but on the whole, expecting real intellectuality of world-class standards from the Japanese is a futile exercise. For me to want to stay in Japan, I'll need to get the best of both worlds, that is, the money-making ability of the Japanese, combined with Western creativity and the shooting-from-the-hip intellectual freedom that I so love about Westerners, Americans, British, Germans, French, etc., all of whose languages I can speak after living 20 years in Europe. Japanese, on the other hand, are so preoccupied with not making the other guy lose face and counting every possible negative nuance that a free intellectual exchange becomes impossible. To a passionate Western intellectual, it's revolting. Even some Japanese intellectuals say the same thing as I do, equating Japan with a brainless economic giant, a cultural black hole that is sucking everything in, giving nothing back. The Japanese intellectual record over the centuries is appalling. The Japanese have won only 5 science Nobel Prizes. There are no world-ranking Japanese philosophers or ideologists or great thinkers. The Japanese don't seem to like abstractions very much, preferring the concrete. The intellectual influence between Japan and the West has been largely a one-way street. Lately, the Japanese have been taking out a large number of engineering patents, in fact half the world's total, but that's not real creativity in my book. The Japanese are, without question, superb engineers, but engineering is largely a matter of effort, of taking pains and making 10% improvements time after time, which the Japanese are very good at. I don't deny that the Japanese are diligent. What is lacking in Japanese culture is true creativity, that is, going outside the norms, by inventing something quite new. I experience this regularly with my young Japanese students that I have to supervise for mini projects. They work well when it's clear to them what the task is, but if I give them an open-ended challenge, they're lost. I suspect that their education and culture does not expect them to express themselves, to say what they think about an issue. There's something terribly wrong with the Japanese education system. I think someone should drop a neutron bomb on the Japanese Department of Education, Monbusho. Monbusho does untold damage to the country and makes foreigners like me have contempt for Japanese intellectual poverty. Japan seems parasitic on other countries, particularly the West, for its ideas because it seems incapable of generating its own. For a Western intellectual, such a failure is truly contemptible. Respecting individual liberties. As a Westerner, one of the aspects of Japanese life that truly disgusts me, and I'm pulling no punches here, I mean truly disgusts me, is the lack of respect for personal liberties that Japanese show each other. I will add progressively, incrementally, examples of the type of thing I mean to this section. Westerners are so accustomed as to be unconscious at times to certain individual liberties that are not part of Japanese social custom. Japanese values are much more groupist and conformist, and in many respects anti-democratic. Remember that Japan is not a real democracy. The democratic veneer, which does exist, was imposed on a profoundly authoritarian people with centuries of dictatorial tradition. The Japanese people are not grassroots democrats. They are passive and uncomplaining, the strong Buddhist and Confucianist influence on Japanese minds. Such a people are easily pushed around by their superiors and generally exploited. Westerners would not tolerate many aspects that are part of daily life in Japan. For example, A. Employment imprisonment in major companies. If you're Japanese and you join a major company, you can expect to be employed for life. This has certain advantages in terms of financial and emotional security, but it's a two-edged sword. You are also imprisoned in that company, because if you quit, you may find it impossible to get a job in another major company. The reason for this is that the employers of the other company reason that an employee who quits the first company may also quit theirs. Japanese employers expect their employees in the major companies to stay in their company for life. Quitting implies disloyalty. This attitude is profoundly shocking to Westerners and shows a total disrespect for the individual needs and desires of the employee. If it ever happened to me, I would just say to Japan, "Screw you, I'm out of here." If it happened to me in the West, I would pick up a rifle and start killing people. Such a liberty, that is the freedom to choose one's job, what one does in life, the freedom to change careers midstream, is so fundamental to Westerners that to be deprived of it would become a war issue. Japan's employment imprisonment would not be tolerated in the West. The lack of this basic freedom makes Westerners look upon Japan as a third world, undemocratic, socially inferior country. It's one of the many reasons why I feel I am paying a high social cost living in this country, that in many respects I feel is too socially inferior to be worthy of me. Often I ask myself, what am I doing in this social shithole? Backwater. B. Early retirement age. Many companies in Japan force their employees to retire at 55. Since Japanese men are living to 75 on average and women to 80, this is a vicious miscarriage of justice. But as usual, the Japanese people are so politically grassroots impassive that they just accept it. They are so insular, so ignorant of how things are done in other countries, that such customs don't seem barbaric, they're just normal. So after retirement, someone fully functional and competent has to find another job, often with an inferior pay and status, and work in it for another decade or more. This custom is unworthy of a nation hoping to be labelled civilized. Now that Japanese young women are refusing traditional Japanese marriage, where the couple consists of a workaholic husband and a housewife wife, with the two rarely seeing each other, at an alarming rate, half of Japanese women of 30 are unmarried, the birth rate has plummeted. Japanese society is now the most rapidly greying society on the planet. The retirement age will have to be raised. In fact, I would like to see the concept of compulsory retirement thrown out altogether. Compulsory retirement, irrespective of one's performance level, based purely on age, is a form of ageism. That's discrimination based on age, and is vicious. Older people, grey panthers, should organise themselves politically and change the retirement laws and customs, as has been done already in the US. If someone gets senile and useless, then they can be fired, retired, or demoted as any other incompetent employee of whatever age. C. Individual privacy. Can you imagine a Western company telephoning the parents of a young female employee on Friday evening at 11 p.m. to check whether she is home and not staying out the night with her boyfriend? This sort of thing still happens in Japan. If word gets out that a young woman is staying the night elsewhere, then her bad reputation will reflect on her ultra-conservative company. And since the Japanese are such groupists, the company feels it has the right to infringe upon the young woman's privacy in such a blatant way. If a Japanese company did that in the West, they'd be sued and would be featured in the media. In fact, it just wouldn't happen in the West. The West has much greater respect for people's private lives, with the exception of puritanical Americans with their attitudes towards their politicians' private lives. D. Ban the pill. After about a week in Japan, I learned that the mini pill was still banned. I was really disturbed by this. It implies to me that Japan is not a democracy, that the Japanese women's movement is toothless, and that the Japanese people must be supremely insular to believe that the mini pill has damaging side effects, as claimed by the Japanese Medical Association and the Japanese Health Ministry. These warnings completely ignore the fact that hundreds of millions of women in the West take the mini pill. Does the Japanese public believe that Western doctors are less competent than Japanese doctors? Actually, such reasoning does not occur to the Japanese, so insular-minded are they. They live in their own little Japanese island world and passively believe and passively obey and believe what their doctors tell them. So Japanese women are not given the right to control their own bodies, nor to have freer sex that Western women have taken for granted since the early 1960s. The Health Ministry simply dictates that the mini pill will remain banned because of the risk of AIDS. The Japanese should stick to condoms, widely used in Japan. This is dictatorship, but to the Japanese it's normal. Japan is not a grassroots democracy. For a country to be a democracy, the population has to complain and put pressure on its politicians to change the country's laws. The politicians have to control the creation and the implementation of the laws, with the assistance of the bureaucrats. In Japan, the bureaucrats are the effective leaders, dictating as they choose. The population is passive and obedient and doesn't complain. Even if it did, the politicians are rather useless and corrupt and don't do much work. My impression is that in terms of the development of a grassroots level democratic feeling, the Japanese are more than a century behind the West. To transform Japan into a real democracy, the population will need to vote for strong politicians who insist on telling the bureaucrats what to do, rather than vice versa. In Japan, it is the bureaucrats who play a key role in proposing new legislation. It really was a tragedy that the Cold War got started when it did. In the first year of the American occupation, Japanese culture was being strongly democratized, but then along came the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the fall of China to the communists. The Japanese are too insular and too uncreative to be able to learn democratic ways of thinking in a hurry. Spontaneous democratization within Japan is thus very slow. They are not creative enough to do it quickly on their own, and they are too insular to be influenced quickly by the West, although hopefully that may change soon with the rise of digital TV, with its hundreds of foreign Western channels, with their unconscious democratic messages. The future. 21st century globalization. It's probably a good place to stop because I'm running out of memory, so I'll stop here. Ciao.